And let's begin the second part of this lecture. And our second speaker is Mr. Abdulla Al Marrar of UAE Space Agency, and he's gonna talk about UAESA capacity building opportunities of MeznSat. Please turn on your camera and say hi to Mr. Abdulla Al Marrar, please.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes. Hi. I really thank you. I really want to say thank you to for this lecture.
Yes, sure.
Yes. Right now, we'll start the lecture, please.
Hi, everyone. I know we have audience in Korea and in the UAE, so good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. My name is Abdulla Al Marrar, and I'll give you a brief about me, a brief introduction about me until while I pull up the slides. So my name is Abdulla Al Marrar. Uh, I've been working in the space agency since beginnings of 2015. So that's a couple of months after the establishment of the UAE Space Agency. And I was very lucky and honored to be part of the Emirates Mars mission, the Emirates Mars missions team. I was in the mechanical team, and I focused on the harness of the spacecraft. I also was and still is, the project manager of MeznSat, and I also hold the position of the head of space projects in the space agency. Okay, here we are. So our presentation today is going to be about the UAE Space Agency building capability opportunities, and we'll specifically talk about MeznSat. So the presentation is basically split into two halves. The first half is going to talk about the UAE space sector and the UAE Space Agency. And then we're going to focus on MeznSat. And finally, we're going to conclude talking about, or basically I'll give you a piece of advice and two things that you can take away with you after this presentation. And remember space by these two things. Two very cool things. Okay. So the beginnings of the space in the UAE. You can see from this picture the founder of the UAE, peace be upon him, Sheikh Zayed, Allah yarhamah. And you can see the folks around him are the astronauts of Apollo 13. And this this picture commemorates the beginnings of the space in the UAE. And this shows you how the founder, Sheikh Zayed, Allah yarhamah, was inspired about space, and and he basically had in mind a future for the UAE in space, as we can see today. So moving on to the UAE space sector. In the UAE space sector, we have three operators. We have Mohammed bin Rashid Space Center. We also have Yasat and Threya, and they merged a couple of years ago. And also, the UAE Space Agency was established, as I mentioned earlier, in 2014. And the establishment of the UAE Space Agency came in the same time as the Emirates Mars mission was announced by His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid. That's also in July 2014. In the space sector, we have more than 1,500 employees. We also have three national universities who provide degrees and programs in space. We have 4 space research and development space centers. That's if we don't count the Mohammed bin Rashid Space Center. So we have the National Space Science Technology Center in Al Ain. We also have Khalifa University Space Innovation Center. We also have a space center in New York University and the space center in Sharjah University. We also have 11 satellites in orbit. and the last spacecraft that was launched and is in orbit now is MeznSat, which we're going to talk about moving along these slides. Now, the space agency. Now, basically, the space agency focuses on a number of things. First of all, the regulation. So the space agency sets the regulation, the rules and regulation around the space sector, and that's to streamline the space sector itself, streamlines the space operators, and basically attracts the space actors or space companies and space investment into the sector in the UAE. Along with that, the space agency also focuses on building capabilities, and MeznSat would be an example of that. Space research and development is also something that the space agency encourages and supports through the centers in the universities. And also we have international cooperations, which we focus on in the agency. And that's basically building collaborations between the UAE and Korea, between the UAE Space Agency and NASA, between the UAE Space Agency and ESA, and so on. And we also encourage and support space exploration. And one of those missions was EMIRATES Mars mission, as I mentioned, which was launched in July of this year, as you may, as all of you may have witnessed and experienced and saw. And also, not long ago, I think 2 weeks ago, Mohammed bin Rashid Space Center also announced a mission to the moon, where they're going to send a lunar rover called Rashid. So that's the space agency. And then I would like to focus on space education, which is a function within the UAE Space Agency, and focuses on building capabilities in the UAE. So this function within the UAE Space Agency focuses on providing training and development programs and opportunities, the research and development side of it as well, with the universities and centers, as I mentioned earlier, and also the space degrees, the space degree programs within the universities. So we also we facilitate the entrance of students who are interested in space to enter these courses and programs, academic programs within the universities. And also the space agency provides scholarships and sponsorships. So moving on to the training and development programs, you can see on the right-hand side here a number of examples of programs. We have the Hamilton Space Camp. We also provide internships within the space agency, but also we do facilitate internships within space centers in the NSSDC and Khalifa University Space Innovation Center as well. We also have another example is the Space Robotics and the Space Academy. So these are a number of training and development programs that are organized by the space agency. For the research and development, as we mentioned, through these centers in the universities, we also have programs. So an example of that is also MeznSat. Since MeznSat is a project that has been and still ongoing with Khalifa University, and we'll talk more about that as we move ahead in the presentation. So as for the space degrees in the UAE, we basically have 3 universities: UAE University, Khalifa University, and the Sharjah University, and they offer at Khalifa University, the Bachelor's and Master's of Science in Aerospace Engineering, also Space Law in Sharjah University, Bachelor's of Space Technology in the UAE University, and also Master's of Space Science in the UAE University. Moving on to the scholarships and sponsorships. So the UAE Space Agency funds and sponsors about 45 students as of today, not only in the country, but also abroad, in universities abroad. And they do sponsor bachelor's of science, masters of science, and PhD students in science, technology, engineering, math, and also law. So I focused on this part, or on this function of the UAE Space Agency, especially for students who might be interested as you move down your career and your academic career, as you graduate from school and enter university. For those of you who are interested in space and might consider pursuing a career in space, these are the programs that are provided by the Space Agency and might be of interest to you. So now moving to MeznSat. What is MeznSat? I'm sure your first question is, what is MeznSat? So basically, MeznSat is it's the first nanosatellite, environmental nanosatellite in the UAE, built by students. So the MeznSat project was a collaboration between the UAE Space Agency, Khalifa University, and the American University of Ras Al Khaimah. And it's basically a 3U CubeSat. Now, what's a 3U CubeSat? A 3U CubeSat is basically, or a nanosatellite, is basically a very small version of a spacecraft, which started out in the early 2000s as a tool for education, a tool for university students to demonstrate their engineering skills in space. That's how it started out in the early 2000s. But it also evolved during the years. Across the years, it evolved and became a tool for technology demonstration, demonstration missions, and also a tool and a CubeSat and a tool for companies which they commercialized and used for actual space missions, which were utilized in their companies to actually provide data and actual information that can be sold out through these companies. So going back to MeznSat, now MeznSat, as you might ask yourself, is what is MeznSat and what does it do? So the scientific mission of MeznSat is basically, as we said, it is an environmental nanosatellite. And what it focuses on, it focuses on the greenhouse gas emissions, specifically methane and CO2. And all of you might have heard about the global warming. Now, what causes global warming and the climate change? So what causes these phenomenon, or what causes this phenomenon, is the emission of greenhouse gases. As I mentioned, specifically CO2 and methane are two gases that are a major factor within the atmosphere, as they are emitted into the atmosphere. It causes the global warming effect, And going back to MeznSat, so we know about this phenomenon. We know that these gases being emitted into the atmosphere cause the global warming effect. So what is MeznSat going to do? So basically, MeznSat is going to, after being launched, which it was on the 28th of September, as it passes or as it orbits around Earth, it will pass over the UAE. And as it passes over the UAE, it hosts a scientific instrument, which is a shortwave infrared spectrometer, and it's number 2 on the right, if you can see the figure there. So it's that camera there, but it's not a camera, it's a spectrometer. And what it does is that as it passes over the UAE, it will measure and detect carbon dioxide, CO2, and methane. And what will basically happen is that as it measures and detects the areas over the UAE, in the atmosphere over the UAE, where these gases are concentrated, the scientists and the students who are working on the science part of MeznSat will go ahead and start studying these locations and identifying the reasons of these emissions in these locations, and start to study how can they reduce these emissions to basically reduce the global warming effect, at least from the UAE. So that's a scientific mission of MeznSat. Now moving on to the students' contribution in MeznSat. The students basically developed, designed, built, integrated, and tested MeznSat all through. So they started from the beginning up to the launch, which was 2 weeks ago, as we said, on the 28th of September. And they worked throughout. And there are some pictures that I'll show you now. You can see here the students soldering some of the boards on MeznSat on the bottom right-hand corner. You can also see them working on the shaker. That's an equipment used for vibration tests. And on the left, you can see MeznSat without the solar panels fixed. And you can see it wired to the ground support equipment and being tested. Here you can see more pictures of integration and testing. You can see on the top right-hand corner the students attaching the solar panels onto MeznSat. And then you can see on the top left-hand corner the picture where MeznSat was inserted into the pod and being shaken on the equipment I just showed you above, but that's a bigger one. And the idea here is to test it for vibration. On the bottom left-hand corner, you can see MeznSat placed into what we call a thermal vacuum chamber. And what this does is basically it simulates the environment of space. And what happens is, as soon as that happens, so what this chamber does is that it pumps out all the air until you reach a certain point in vacuum, and then it starts heating the surrounding and the environment within the chamber to basically mimic and simulate what happens in space. And then we operate the spacecraft to make sure that it withstands these harsh environments. And then on the right, you can see the students placing MeznSat into the pod. Now, what this pod is basically, it holds MeznSat during launch. And then when the launch vehicle places or reaches the orbit dedicated to MeznSat, it basically opens the door and deploys MeznSat into its orbit. Then you can see here the final integration where the MeznSat was placed into the pod. Now what you saw in the previous pictures are the blue pod, which is basically a pod that is used for testing, but the actual pod that was used is the golden one you can see here, and you can also see MeznSat's logo in the middle. And on the left picture, you can see the pod integrated onto the launch adapter. Now this launch adapter gets placed and fixed onto the launch vehicle, of course, before it launches. Let me also show you a footage of launch. Sorry about that. I'll play it now. You can see here the launch vehicle, the Russian Soyuz. It's called the Soyuz launch vehicle, Soyuz rocket. You can see here the MeznSat logo also. Off it goes here. You can see it ascending here. That's a very cool video of MeznSat's launch. And then this basically takes us to the conclusion. Now for the conclusion, I have a piece of advice that I'd like to share with you. And it's basically always follow your passion. Whenever you like something, especially when it comes to your career and what to choose, in your case, approaching the graduation of school and entering university, you always have to follow your passion. So if you have a passion for engineering, if you have a passion for physics, you like physics, get into that field and always follow your passion. You can see the quote here that says, all you need is passion. If you have passion for something, you will create the talent. And passion is always a driver for innovation. It's always a driver that will drive you to push boundaries when it comes to what you like. And and if it's, for example, if it's space, you'll see yourself pushing boundaries, you'll see yourself progressing and innovating because of your passion. So that's a piece of advice that I would I wanted to share with you. And the other two things that I wanted to share with you as well, and would like you to take with you after this presentation, there are two very cool things. The first one is you can access the Emirates Mars mission site through www.emm.ae. You can see here, sorry, it takes you to this website. And in this website, you can track the HOPE probe by clicking this link on the bottom right-hand corner here. And it also gives you some information on Emirates Mars mission, the distance covered, the speed. But once you click on that link, it will take you to this animation. You can basically see the HOPE probe. You can also play with the screen. And this red line represents the trajectory of HOPE probe, and so the beginning of the red line is when HOPE probe was launched, and you can also play with that, play with time and see, for example, at the beginning of launch. I'm sorry, I have difficulties scrolling. But anyways, you can play with this, and this also gives you some metrics. It gives you the speed of EMM, the distance remaining, and it's basically you can see also the trajectory that will take the HOPE probe to Mars. And by if you see the red line, by the time HOPE probe is at the end of the red line, Mars will also be there, and that will be hopefully in February of 2021. You can also control speed, so you can have it instead of 1 second, the speed of 1 week. So 1 second will equal to 1 week, and you can see how things change. So that's one thing. The other thing is this website here. You can access this website called Cellestrack. You can press on this link as well. And by pressing this link, it will take you to a similar program. But this time, the difference is that this focuses on Earth. And if you give it some time to load, give it some time. You can see here that it tracks about 19,000 spacecraft. You see here, about 19,872 spacecraft orbiting Earth. And orbiting Earth on all the different orbits. So we have the low Earth orbit, the medium Earth orbit, and also the geosynchronous orbit. These are the three main. There are other orbits, but these are the three main orbits. And one cool thing I'd like to show you, you can, for example, you can search whatever spacecraft by name, by country. So what I'd like to do is show you the ones that belong to the UAE. So you can type in UAE in the search area here. You can see all 12 spacecraft. I did mention 11 in orbit, but 12 that are here. One of them, Freya 1, is basically a dead spacecraft. So you can select all these spacecraft that belong to the UAE and monitor their orbit real time. You can play with the speed as well here. So scrolling this here, you can see MeznSat. You can play with the screen as well. So this is the cool thing number 2 that I would like you to take back after this presentation, and something that you can take with you to remember space. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. Thank you for your attention.
Mr. Abdulla Al Marrar, I really would like to express my sincere and gratitude to you and for giving us such an excellent lecture. And for through this opportunity, it was able to understand things that were not easily understood. Really, thank you very much. And from now on, we'll give some questions to you that I get from the other persons or the chatting questions. Can you reply right now? Yes. The first question is that after MeznSat was launched, and what is the next project that UAE is preparing?
So in terms of the project, there are several projects to be honest, and so we have let's say segments or categories of space missions. So we have the educational space missions. We also have the technology demonstrators, and we have the big missions or the space exploration missions. So in terms of educational projects that are coming up, we have another CubeSat that's called LightSat. That's also being developed by Khalifa University in collaboration with New York University here in the UAE. In terms of the technology demonstrators, we are also having a project with the National Space Science Technology Center, NSSTC in Al Ain, and they are working on a technology demonstrator that will demonstrate GNSS AS, which is basically global navigation satellite systems, specifically augmentation systems in the low Earth orbit. And in terms of space exploration missions, as I mentioned in the presentation, the Mohammed bin Rashid Space Center has just recently announced a mission to the moon, and that will hopefully be launched by 2024 as per the announcement.
Thank you so much. And the second question is on the chatting. And do you think that UAE will have its own spaceport one day?
Hopefully. I mean, there has been talks and discussions in the past to have a spaceport in the UAE and specifically in Al Ain, utilizing the Al Ain airport or part of the airport to actually be a spaceport. But that's still in discussion. But definitely, I think that has been discussed and been thought of.
Thank you so much. And the third question is that if we successfully move into Mars, and how can we solve problems of the solar energy shortage caused by the distance from the sun?
Can you please repeat the question, sorry?
So if we successfully move to Mars, let's pretend that we move to the Mars, and that in the Mars there's a shortage and there's lots far further than Earth, so there's a shortage of the energy of the sun. Can you understand it?
Yes, sure.
Yeah.
So to be honest, I mean, there are lots of challenges to reach to Mars. The cultivating solar energy on Mars is probably one of them, but there are lots of other challenges that we face thinking about reaching Mars or thinking about taking humans to Mars. But in terms of cultivating solar energy on Mars, I mean, there are missions that already reached the surface of Mars. They landed on Mars, and they use solar panels and they use solar energy. They do, however, face some challenges with the dust. So there are lots of dust storms in Mars. And what happens is that the dust accumulates on the solar panels, which prevents the actual sunlight to reach the actual cells, solar cells. So that's a very pressing challenge in regards to cultivating solar energy on Mars. However, the actual use of solar energy on Mars is valid, and it happens, and it has been used. It has been used by all the missions that landed on Mars.
Well, thank you. And there's two questions on the chatting. The first question is that when did the UAE launch its first satellite?
Yeah, so the UAE launched its first satellite in the 1990s, and it was launched by the company that I told you about, called Al Thuraya. Yes, and it's called Al Thuraya 1, and it's basically the one that I mentioned to be a dead satellite because it's very old, and it got replaced by Al Thuraya 2 and Al Thuraya 3.
And the next question is from the chatting too. And then how will you affect the future of the space industry in the UAE?
Yes. So to be honest, the youth today in the UAE are an actual driver of the space industry in the UAE. So if we take an example and look at the Emirates Mars mission, you'll have to know for a fact that more than 90% of the team on Emirates Mars mission are of the youth. So their ages are less than 30. So that gives you an example and gives you an idea of how youth are into space in its beginnings. And if that is the beginning for youth, I would see, and I would reckon that the future of space will be through its youth.
Oh, very nice. And is my personal question. Can I
Sure.
ask you?
Yes, sure. Go ahead.
So I wonder that if you have a plan between the Korea and UAE, the corporation, or the other project that UAE Space Agency think about with cooperate with Korea.
Oh, yes. To be honest, we do have one of the research and development projects that we have specifically with Khalifa University Space Innovation Center. And it is, the project has not kicked off yet, but it is directed towards development of power systems, batteries for space use. And it is, even though it has not kicked off yet, but the PIs, or what we call the investigators on this project, have already been in discussion with Korea. So there's a collaboration, a possible collaboration there, especially with KARI. So I mean, the collaboration is always ongoing with Korea.
Thank you. And the next question is on the question list that I get from the students. The third is that the MeznSat is expected to measure the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, right?
Yes.
So
yes.
can we predict that the amount of greenhouse gases in the future and prevent natural disasters in advance?
So specifically, MeznSat will not be able to predict the greenhouse gas emissions in the future. But what it does is that it will measure the greenhouse gas emissions, specifically the carbon dioxide and methane, in the atmosphere over the UAE during its orbit. So what will happen is that it will generate a trend of measurements, and it will also locate and provide data in terms of the locations of these emissions in the UAE. Of course, after receiving this data, the scientists will use this data to perform to utilize the trends and the actual data sets to be able to generate algorithms and predict the future, or let's say the concentrations or the greenhouse gas emission locations in the future, and how to reduce these emissions, and to reduce the main sources of these emissions in the UAE, which will eventually contribute to the global warming war, let's say.
For the next two questions is on the chatting. The first is that what are some of the rockets that KU is currently developing?
In terms of rockets, there are no rockets that the Khalifa University are developing at the moment. So I mentioned there was a question in the chat about about the studies and the knowledge of rockets, and whether the UAE will get or will develop rockets in the future or not. And I mentioned as an answer that the National Space Science and Technology Center in Al Ain, the NSSTC in Al Ain, that is associated with the UAE University, will very soon open a lab that is dedicated and focused on propulsion systems. So they will study propulsion systems, which will, of course, enable the UAE to go through that path in the future. But in terms of rockets, actual rockets or launch vehicles, the UAE does not have any, or did not start developing any in any time, يعني in the current time frame.
Thank you. For next question is that I get from the students, that he says that I read the news's article about the microsatellites like MeznSat and get interested. The article introduces a method of using multiple nanosatellites in duster foam, but I am curious about the advantage of using this method and what kind of research is possible. Also, what are some of the researches using this nanosatellite?
So as I mentioned, specifically for MeznSat, the environmental nanosatellite, as I mentioned in the past, what will happen is that MeznSat will measure the concentrations of greenhouse gas emissions, specifically carbon dioxide and methane, in the atmosphere over the UAE. So as it passes in its orbits, as it passes over the UAE, it will measure and detect the concentrations of carbon dioxide and methane in certain areas, and from that data that will be downlinked to the ground stations, the scientists will use these data sets and information to basically research on how to reduce the effect of greenhouse gas emissions in these locations, and to understand how or what are the actual contributors to these emissions, to eventually reduce them and reduce the global warming effect, at least from the UAE vicinity.
And it could be a last question. So can I ask you to tell something some a word to Korean and UAE the students who want to go to the aerospace area?
Sure. And it's probably building on what I mentioned in the presentation. I mean, an important thing when you pursue a certain career, or when you enter a certain specialization, especially for you guys that will graduate from school eventually and enter university, you'll be, you'll be questioned, or you'll ask yourself, what specialization should I enter? Should I go into engineering? Should I go into physics? Or should I go into law? Or should I go? So the main thing, or the main advice that I would give you, is that follow your passion. See what you like. See what you get interested by. So for example, if you are fascinated by the stars at night, and you really like astronomy and how these stars came about, you are most probably leaning towards physics. So if that's something that interests you, if that's something that you like and you have a passion for, follow that passion and get into that career and get into that specialization, because this passion will be a driver for you to innovate, for you to create new things, because it's always the passion that drives you to success.
Oh, really good word for all students. I really thank you, and I really appreciate you. It is my my personal question is that, can I ask your personal goals or your personal project that you would do after this Corona situation?
Yeah. So in terms of the Corona situation, it affected the whole world since the beginning of this year. But as things progressed, and as the scientists and worldwide, they understood more about Corona, the things are basically getting back to normal. But taking into consideration all the precautions and safety precautions that you'll have to consider. So for us, for example, in the UAE, in the beginning, so for a period of time, things stopped. So everything. So for example, we never used to go to work. We used to work remotely at home. But as things became easier, as things as the people understood more about what Corona is and how we can prevent ourselves and take precautions, we started going back to work as normal, but of course taking all, as I said, all the safety precautions into consideration.
Really so much. Really thank you so much. In the time, unfortunately, there's in the empty time. And I recommended to all attendants to turn on your camera. And for the Korean, I know in my knowledge that the thank you to Islam is at your word is shukran is right.
Yes, yes.
Yes. So all attendants, please turn on your camera. And for the Korean student and for UAE student, all of them, I recommended you to say shukran, say thank you for the Abdullah Amar for this lecture.
Shukran.
Really thank you.
Thank you.
And shukran.
Shukran.
Thank you. Most
Really,
welcome. My pleasure.
really thank you so much. And we can know that maybe we don't know, and for the passion, and me too as a student, I will study hard and work for the aerospace for the future. Everyone say thank you for the chatting, or turn on your mic and turn and say to thank you for Abdul Amar once more time. And for now, before having a last part, we will have a 8 minute break. And really thank you for Mr. Abdul Amar for this lecture and for the good reply.
Sure. My pleasure, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Thanks.